Hey guys, it's Dan here. In this week's episode, let's talk about ESG committees. So in this video, you will learn a few things. First of all, what is an ESG committee in general? What is the role of an ESG committee in theory? And then we will look at some practical examples to see if an ESG committee is just greenwashing or if it's more than that, of course. All that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's roll. Okay, so ESG committee. Let's start with the basics. First of all, ESG, for what is it actually? It stands for environmental, social, and governance. All these words sound very nice, but it's very theoretical. So let's put something in behind of these words to illustrate it in a better way. So here you can see these are called the ESG factors, and as you can see, you have the E, you have the S, and you have the G. And I wanted to walk you through quickly because it's always more than we expect actually. When we look at the environmental impact, of course the first thing that pops into your mind is probably CO2 emissions and all these things. That's of course the first on the list. But then of course you also have everything related to air and water pollution, biodiversity, so basically the number of plants and animals we have, deforestation, energy efficiency. That's a huge thematic when it comes to real estate, for example, waste management and water scarcity. But also on the social side, for example, you would think about maybe human rights, but it's much more than that, as you can see, because there are things that come into play, for example, such as customer satisfaction, data protection and privacy. That's a huge one, especially when you look at all the hacks and all these things that have happened in the past and will continue to happen, especially banks and financial institutions. And gender and diversity, well, that's a huge debate right now. Employee engagement, community relations, and then of course the last two big ones, of course, human rights and labor standards, especially for example in poorer countries. And here we have a great example. There were a lot of suicides at Foxconn, which is a huge Chinese company which makes almost all the iPhones in the world. And basically, due to this ESG committee and how people think, Apple had to respond, of course, to what was happening in a Foxconn factory, even if Foxconn doesn't belong to Apple. It's just a subcontractor, but it's such a big matter that even the big guys, especially for image and for customer satisfaction and so on, they have to respond to these kind of problems, of course. And then governance, that's a very theoretical word, but it's very important to understand that. They are dealing with the standards basically for running a company, which means, for example, the board composition, who sits in a board, who is allowed to sit inside, then audit committee structure, that's very important. How do you control your own business basically? Then of course bribery and corruption, especially it of course in the US but also abroad. Executive compensation, huge topic. How much should a CEO make? Should there be a cap or not, for example? Lobbying, of course, always a big debate. Political contribution and whistleblower schemes, for example. So as you can see, these ESG topics are much broader than a lot of people expect. But the most important thing you have to keep in mind about ESG is when we're talking about an ESG committee, they are not doing it to improve the world or something like that. But the question is always, what is the impact on my business here? Okay, so they are not trying to solve the biggest problems of humanity, but they are trying to understand if there is climate change in the future, which everybody knows will happen at some point. What is the impact on my business if I am an oil company, for example, or if I am a telecom company or whatever, you know? So it's always very much related to the business, and this is why it becomes more and more important, because there's one thing you have to understand, of course. The share price of a company doesn't depend on the past, but it's always driven by future expectations, future cash flow, future growth, future profits, future scandals, and all these things. So of course, environmental impacts, for example, or social impacts, human rights, and all these things you have to face them, of course, because they will impact your share price in the future, and of course also your customer satisfaction and probably also your employee satisfaction. When you think, for example, about Google, a lot of employees, the top employees, said they would leave the company if Google would work with the US government and the US Army, for example. So as you can see, ESG is not only for outside of the company, but also very important when it comes, for example, to employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction, of course. Okay, now that we know what an ESG committee does on a regular basis, let's look at a company example and you will see that is it greenwashing or is it a real thing? Well, let me explain it like this. I would say before, let's say 2019 or something like that, the ESG committee was a bit like the cybersecurity committee. We knew it was important, so on, but it was more like a marketing thing, you know, to make sure that everybody's happy, you know, it has been cleaned by the ESG committee and these kind of things. So it was kind of a side thing for a company, same as cybersecurity. But as you know, with all the cyber crimes, for example, cybersecurity became more and more important, and of course with all the big social scandals as well as climate change and all these things, well, ESG committees basically became the top of the pyramid. So let me explain how a typical company, a new big financial company, a fund, for example, like BlackRock or something like that, they were really pushing hard for this since last year, basically. Why? Think about it. Why should a fund, an investment fund like BlackRock, why should they push hard on ESG matters? Well, it's pretty simple. Imagine if you are managing the money of the world, for example, you are investing it in the future into the next 20, 30, 50 years, for example. Think about the pension plans and all these things. Of course, as a risk manager at BlackRock, for example, you have to consider the factors that come into play for the next 10, 20, 30 years, of course. And everybody knows that climate change and social issues will play a bigger role, such as cybersecurity, for example. Because, of course, at some point it can drag down your share price if you are not acting properly, if you are using dirty energy, if you are abusing human rights and all these things. Of course, it's gonna with social media and all these things, it pops up much quicker now, and little scandals become like massive right now. So this is why it's so important. But now let me quickly explain. So basically, imagine this is the new kind of a company structure. You have, let's say, all the employees on the bottom. The top of the employees would be the CEO, for example, and above the CEO there is the board, and above the board there is the ESG committee. So how does it work? Well, for basic decisions, employees need some kind of CEO or CFO approval, okay? And for all the bigger stuff, let's say bigger investments and all these things, the CEO will need board approval. And of course the CEO is appointed by the board, so if he's not working correctly, he's gonna be out of the picture, of course. So he needs board approval, let's say for a big investment decision. And the board needs the ESG committee's approval. And also, as I just mentioned earlier, the board is appointed by the ESG committee, which has a big word to say here, at least in new companies, new kind of structures, of course. So now, what is the ESG committee doing on top of the pyramid, and why is it so important? Well, think about it as the ESG committee as a filter, basically, and for investment decisions and all other kinds of decisions. But let's take the example of an investment decision. And the best or the most famous one, for example, right now is Bitcoin. Why do you think Bitcoin prices went down over the last couple of months? Well, because the institutional investors, the really big players on the market, such as BlackRock, Vanguard, all the hedge funds, all these huge companies, why are they not allocating a portion of their portfolio, well, into Bitcoin, for example? Well, that's basically a very simple answer to that. Because the ESG committee, for example, of BlackRock, has said no to Bitcoin. And when they say no to an investment decision, they don't forget they are on top of the pyramid, well then the managers below and the board cannot say yes, and they cannot invest if the ESG committee is saying no. So let's talk about the Bitcoin example, because it's pretty interesting. What do we know about Bitcoin so far? Well, when you look at the ESG committees and the big funds, the first question they raised when let's say ESG when Bitcoin got approved, let's say, by the governments and so on, was, okay, where is Bitcoin made and how is it made, basically. And this is what raised the entire questions, actually, because a lot of people found out that actually most Bitcoins are mined in China. China is on a sanction list with the US, human rights problems, and of course dirty energy to produce Bitcoins, such as coal, for example. And that's why that was kind of a double no-no right now, because Bitcoin, first of all, mainly made in China. We don't know exactly how it's made. It's probably made out of dirty fossil fuels. It's probably made in well, with some social issues and these kind of things. So basically, that's why they said no so far. And the entire Bitcoin situation will only be solved, and the big guys will only invest inside Bitcoin, well, when the ESG committee gives green light, which means Bitcoin needs to be made out of clean energy. It has to be certified by let's say the miner or something like that. And it has to be in a country, let's say Canada or Finland or something, or Iceland, where energy is green and where there are no problems with let's say social issues and these kind of things. So yeah, I hope that you now have a better idea of what an ESG committee is doing, let's say here in 2021 in the US, with all these things that have happened in the past. I think we have learned quite a lot, and ESG committees are getting more and more powerful, and actually it all started from the big guys. So actually what happens is when a company like BlackRock decides not to invest anymore, let's say, in fossil fuels and these kind of things, that has a much bigger impact, let's say, than people going on the street and claiming things, you know. That's also important, but that's not how, if finance changes direction, that's going to change a lot of things. So I'm pretty optimistic about this stuff, and let's wait and see for the next couple of years. But the Bitcoin example is a pretty good one that shows you how powerful ESG committees became, actually. So now that you know all that stuff, I hope this was helpful and interesting. Don't forget to like, of course, to spread the word, of course. Don't forget to subscribe if you like corporate and market finance. I post once a week, every Sunday. Enjoy your week, stay smart, stay safe. Bye bye, guys. Enjoy.